Welcome to Alt Schwift X. You remember Alt Schwift X, don't you? It was this dumb show where this disembodied voice rambled about Game of Thrones for a bit, and it was alright. It was enjoyed. It was enjoyed by some. A good time was had. There were a whole bunch of episodes. In fact, there were 71 episodes, and then it was cut down in its prime by a silly misunderstanding about copyright law, which got live streaming privileges revoked on YouTube, which was a tragedy. Um, well, poor choice of words, because there is an actual tragedy, a non-sarcastic tragedy, the death of Roy Daltrey's, the guy who did the audiobooks for Game of Thrones, and who was much beloved by many Game of Thrones fans, and to whom I think we should dedicate this episode, because he was very special to a lot of people in this community. And so this episode is. Oh, can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Well, I've got to remember how to live stream again. It's tricky. But this is episode 72. This is the penultimate episode in book 1 of Game of Thrones Abridged on Alt Schwift X. This is Catelyn 11. Catelyn 11, a Game of Thrones. And this is the chapter where Catelyn is returning to Riverrun with her son Robb after all the shit that's been going down with the death of Ned and the battle of the Whispering Woods and all the siege of Riverrun and all that stuff. And this is the climax of Robb's journey as a political player, and it's a huge moment in Catelyn's perspective in terms of her familial connections with the Tullys, in terms of her mothering of her son Robb. And it's an interesting perspective on the political shit that goes down. Before we get into it, one request. Does anyone know? I mean, speaking of Roy Daltrey's, someone was keeping track of the length of these Alt Schwift X episodes compared to the length of the official audiobook episodes. And I'm pretty sure for a while we were ahead. There was this sort of ironic, great thing where this so-called abridged series was actually longer than the full-length audiobooks. If someone wants to count up how long Alt Schwift X is so far and compare that to the audiobooks, we could then work out how long the finale episode needs to be in order for this abridged series to actually be longer than the official audiobooks, which I just think would be funny. And yeah, also there's no Reddit thread for this live stream, but if you want to go ahead and make one, you're welcome to. If you have questions about this chapter or comments you want me to respond to, make a thread on the Alt Schwift X subreddit, which is linked in the description, and I'll check that at the end of the stream and we can respond if you've got any questions there. Anyway, without any further ado, let's get into Catelyn 11, A Game of Thrones. It seemed 1,000 years ago, Catelyn says, that she carried her son Robb out of Riverrun. So she's talking about the time, whatever it was, 14 years ago, when Catelyn left her home of Riverrun to go to this strange new land in the north with the Starks to wed Eddard Stark. And that past seems like a very long time ago to Catelyn now, who is returning to her home of Riverrun. And she reflects on how crazy it is for her son Robb to have grown up like this. She reflects on how Robb, last time she was here, wore swaddling clothes, and now he's wearing plate and mail. And she reflects on the crazy, freaky magic of spurting out a little acorn boy who turns into a giant man tree. Wow, that's a gross analogy. It could have. Well, look, but it's the miracle of life is what we're witnessing here. Watching a child grow into an adult is a miraculous thing, is what Catelyn's telling us. And she looks upon Robb, who is sitting with his direwolf Greywind on the boat with his escort, which includes Theon Greyjoy, Brynden Blackfish, Greatjon Umber, and Rickard Karstark, which is a motley crew, I would say. Theon, of course, ends up betraying Robb, Greyjoy that he is. Rickard Karstark ends up defying Robb, and Robb has to execute Rickard. The Great John's loyal through and through, and Bryndon's pretty great, but certainly a mixed bag of skittles on this particular vessel that Robb's got going. And so they're approaching the castle of Riverrun, where Catelyn spent her childhood. And we have a description of the castle and the stream and the wheel of the tower, which takes Catelyn right back to her girlhood. It's evoking the memories of her past. And she describes the castle, and they describe the Tully banners, which is of course a fish, which is definitely one of the less impressive heraldic symbols of Westeros, alongside the stag and the lion and the dragon and the wolf. The fish is not so intimidating, but it must be said the Tullys do have a certain wily tendency to survive. Do you think that the banners are? What do you think comes first, the horse or the cart in this situation? Do the Lannisters see their lion Lannister banner and go, wow, I better act like a ferocious lion, therefore, and I will act proud and violent? Or do you think that they adopted the Lannister banner because they were already proud and violent? Which one comes first? I mean, I suppose the banners are so old, thousands of years old, that it's sort of got to be the banner coming first, doesn't it? But I suppose it goes both ways. The symbols that we adopt certainly shape us, and we do shape the symbols that we adopt, because sometimes we change the symbols that we use. Sometimes flags change and emblems change. Is it the Cleveland Indians in America who they're talking about changing the name or the logo because it's offensive to use the that sounds political, doesn't it? But it's interesting how symbols shape us and how we shape symbols, isn't it? Anyway, so Catelyn's like, look, this Tully banner would have made me feel so good before. It would have raised my spirits, would have made me feel proud about my family. But right now, I feel like nothing could make me feel happy because I'm still in grief for the death of my husband, Eddard Stark. And the way she describes that grief, the way she thinks that maybe I'll never feel happy again, it's kind of reminiscent of Arya talking about her grief and her pain. Because Arya, at one point in Storm, I think, talks about how she has a hole in her heart, and the hole will never feel anything better. So, of course, one of the things that people always talk about with Game of Thrones is that there's a lot of death in Game of Thrones. That is true. There's a lot of death. There's a lot of suffering. There's a lot of awful things happening. But it's not for no reason that George Martin does that. Part of the point of all this violence and suffering is to give us a chance to reflect on the meaning of suffering and the meaning of our responses to suffering. I think George Martin spends a lot of time ruminating on grief and on our responses. And so one of the themes of this chapter is about like vengeance and about like peace and hope and all of these different emotions and responses that can come about as a result of loss. Maybe, I mean, part of the point of art, right, is to look at extremes and to look at fantasies and hypotheticals and to look at these outer limits of human behavior and reality, to push human experience to the limits of what it can be, in order for us to explore and examine what our responses really are. It's at those great extremes that we see who we are. That's what Westworld is. That's sort of the Westworld hypothesis, isn't it? The Westworld hypothesis was that you put people in this extreme environment of complete freedom and complete alienation from responsibility and complete violence and all of that, and it's in that extreme pressure cooker environment that true human spirit is revealed. I think that might be bullshit, at least in the context of Westworld, but I think that's maybe the hypothesis, and I think that maybe that's similar to the point of the suffering in Game of Thrones. It's through extremes that we can truly learn the truths about human nature, and maybe that's why art is what it is. No tangents. And so they're approaching the castle, and there's so Riverrun's pretty cool, by the way. It's like like I don't know if you know this. Hot fact. So Riverrun's located at like the fork of a river, like the Y shape of a river. I think I described this before. If you do like a Winston Churchill victory V sign, or a French "fuck you, we've got your Bowman fingers" sign, depending on your location across the channel. If you make a Y sign, Riverrun is located in between your fingers. And so Riverrun has these two barriers flowing either side of it as like a natural defense. And so it's got all these portcullises and bridges and stuff, and it's designed masterfully to take advantage of the rivers and the natural defense that they provide. And as they're entering, Catelyn looks at the portcullis that closes over this rushing river, and she thinks about how much the rust might have damaged this portcullis, and whether the portcullis might hold up to a battering ram, and what she might have to do to look after the defenses of this castle. Which reminds me of, remember in season 7 when Sansa was walking around Winterfell and she like pointed out some like breastplates that were being made, some armor, and she said, "Oh, are you putting leather on that steel? It better be important for the stuff." And a lot of viewers responded by going like, "Oh, that's so dumb that Sansa would have thoughts and opinions and information about battle preparations and stuff. That's so silly and unrealistic, because she's a girl and she wouldn't have been trained or knowledgeable about that stuff." But I mean, it's a pretty striking comparison. It happens here. Catelyn has opinions and information about this stuff. So if it is a crime to for a character to do that, George Martin does it just like the show does, I think, or at least there's a similarity there. And yeah, by the way, I'm not paying close attention to the live stream, because I think sometimes it's distracting, but we'll keep experimenting with that. But yeah, if you're burning with questions, chuck them in a Reddit thread on AltSwiftX subreddit, and I'll respond to it there. Or stream donations are also always responded to at the end. But other than that, we'll keep on moving on. And so they approach the Tullys of Riverrun, who are coming to greet them. There's Edmure Tully, Catelyn's brother, who has auburn hair and a fiery beard, which is another one of those little appearance differences. Edmure in the show was pretty nondescript, dark hair, no beard. I kind of do wish a little bit that they were a little bit more close to the books in terms of just like hair color and stuff, because I feel like that wouldn't have been too hard to get right, and it would. I mean, it would also just help, just on the level of making it easier for show watchers who haven't read the books to identify who's a part of whose family. Because in Westeros, people have this genetically implausible thing where people of different families tend to have iconic hair colors: Lannister blonde, Stark brown, Tully red. It would have made things easier if they kept those colors in the show, I think. Isn't it wacky how Jaime in the show goes from like Prince Charming peroxide blonde to like dirty brown by the end of the series? I think you actually can argue that there's a thematic meaning to that maybe Jaime's like pride and arrogance and Lannister identity does decay and become something more humble and honest and simple by becoming brown, and indeed shorter and stubblier later in the show. So yeah, actually, but perhaps Jaime's hair is meant to be like that. Although Tyrion's hair goes from blonde to brown for no particular reason, simply because I think in the pilot he was like dyed or wearing a wig, but they just took that out for just production convenience later on. So the point is, let's not overthink hair, ladies and gentlemen. Hair does not deserve quite this much attention, perhaps. And so they're going into Riverrun, and they're greeting Edmure Tully, and they are greeting Tytos Blackwood. And Catelyn notices that Edmure was wearing his blue and red cloak, which is stained with blood and smoke. You'd think he probably could have gotten a replacement cape. You'd think that probably somewhere in the Riverrun castle he could have gotten a shiny new clean red and blue cape, but perhaps the reason why he wears this bloodied smoked one is as a point of pride, just to show that, hey look, I've been in battles, mate. I've been out fighting the good fight. I've been sticking pigs with sticks. It's been a great time. Look how valuable I am as a man. I think there's a certain, probably reading way too much into it, but maybe Edmure's just using this bloodied cloak as a way to try to prove himself, and it betrays some insecurity in how he thinks he's viewed by others, and he thinks he needs to like. Can you imagine Great John? All right. Great John Umber would wear a bloodied cloak, but he wouldn't wear a bloodied cloak because he wants you to see that he's wearing a bloodied cloak. He'd just wear a bloodied cloak because he ain't got time to launder. That would be Great John Umber. Anyway, so they're approaching Edmure and Tytos and all these other Tully affiliates, and they go under the portcullis, and they land at River Run, and Greywind the Direwolf jumps out and freaks out some soldiers, which is something that happens a lot in the books. They very frequently make passing reference to the fact that it's pretty spooky having these giant wolfos hanging around all the time, nipping at people's bits. It's a bit unsettling. But in the show, they just ride out Ghost from entire seasons. Invisible, like a ghost. And so Theon helps Catelyn out of the boat onto land by lifting her and picking her up by the waist, which is kind of a funny image. And then Catelyn embraces her brother Edmure. Edmure has a mouth made for smiles, but he was not smiling now. That's one of the other things about Game of Thrones, is there's people who thrive in hard times and conflict and war, and people who don't. Edmure is one of the people who doesn't. You can imagine Edmure being a great lord in times of peace, but sadly in the time of war, in the War of Five Kings, Edmure is not really all that good at this sort of shit, which is a shame. Meanwhile, there are people like, I don't know, Roose Bolton, or Ramsay Bolton, or Tywin even, or they sort of thrive in peace as well. Anyway, and so they're arriving at River Run, and Edmure instantly mentions Lord Eddard, and he says, "I swear the Lannisters will pay. You will have your vengeance." And then Catelyn says back, "Well, will your vengeance bring Ned back to me?" And that, in those two lines, sort of captures one of the fundamental conflicts of this chapter. It's about vengeance versus a practical recognition that vengeance doesn't achieve anything, or at least that vengeance doesn't bring back what you lost. I mean, you can certainly argue that vengeance has a place in terms of just like maintaining social order. Vengeance socially serves a function of showing that if you transgress, if you break the rules, you will be punished, and therefore vengeance is a way to deter people from transgressing in the future. People are less likely to murder if they know that murderers get hung, drawn, and quartered. However, murderers being hung, drawn, and quartered does not bring murder victims back to life, at least not usually. Past results do not determine future events. What's that line? Anyway, so they're at River Run, they're having a party. They're not having a party yet. They're talking about Lord Hoster. They're talking about Catelyn's father, Hoster Tully, who is bedridden and sick and not very well. In the show, of course, they actually start this episode or this scene with Hoster dead in a boat and him being pushed out. They don't have the time for all this discussion of Hoster, which is a shame because Hoster's role in this chapter is kind of nice, which we'll get to shortly. And Catelyn briefly mentions that it was here at River Run that her brother, that Brandon Stark, Ned Stark's brother, once duelled Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, for Catelyn's hand years ago. They mention the River Run guardsmen who wear fish crest helms, which has got to be one of the least intimidating of the animal-shaped helms in Westeros. Fish-shaped helms. Well, what do you reckon that even looks like? Are they like fish fins? Fish fingers? Fish mouths or heads? I don't know which would be more intimidating for a helm. Maybe intimidation's not the goal. Maybe they're trying to get people to misunderestimate them, so that someone will be like, "Oh, that's a bloody cod. I need not be concerned of your martial prowess." And then before you know it, you've been fucking taken by the Great Whites, like Aquaman, like Khal Drogo without his shirt, just fucking tidal waving you right up in the salt water. Maybe that's a strategy with the Tully helms. Who knows? But Catelyn is reacting to the news that Hoster Tully, her father, is sick and dying, and she responds with a feeling of rage. It's an angry grief. She feels that she's lost Ned. She feels like she's lost her sister Lysa, who's just been kind of useless. Edmure has been so dumb lately. The Lannisters have been attacking her. The Maces have been useless. The gods, she feels, have done her an injustice because everything's going against her. She seems to be losing everything, and she feels angry about that. It's interesting to look at this stuff in light of what we know happens to Catelyn later, i.e. Lady Stoneheart. At the moment, Catelyn is mostly advocating peace, or at least not vengeance. Later, she turns into the vengeful Lady Stoneheart, who is completely bent on killing everyone who did her wrong. Which is an interesting contrast, although this rage that we see Catelyn feel is perhaps a hint of that vengeful violence that we see emerge in Stoneheart later on. Stoneheart is not like a complete 360 or a complete 180 of Catelyn's character. There are perhaps the foundations for Stoneheart's vengeance in Catelyn's rage. And we also have Catelyn reflect on, this is actually kind of my fault because I took Tyrion Lannister. Catelyn abducted Tyrion Lannister because she thought that Tyrion was responsible for Bran's assassination attempt. And that's sort of what started the War of the Five Kings, and Catelyn acknowledges here that she done goofed. And yeah, Hoster mentioned that the reason why, Edmure mentions that the reason why Catelyn wasn't told earlier that her father Hoster was dying is that he needed to keep it a secret from everyone, because if the realm somehow found out that Hoster was dying, he would no longer look strong, and therefore his realm might be attacked, which is one of those incredibly depressing realities of being a feudal lord, or probably of being any kind of like politician, in fact, or public figure, is that you have to look strong all the time. You have to look tough. If you want to keep your status and your responsibility, you have to seem fearsome, or people will swoop on you like fucking vultures. I promise not to be political, but remember in the presidential campaign when everyone was like, "Oh, Hillary Clinton's done a wobbly. Hillary Clinton is sick. She's got pneumonia or something," and it was this huge fucking news story for ages. Hillary Clinton sneezed. Sneeze Watch 2017. Sneezegate. Sniffle Watch. Like, just 24-hour coverage of a fucking mucous membrane. And it's like, mate, I mean, yeah, maybe it's relevant to the public interest to some extent. But the point is that, like, it must suck being a public figure and having to pretend to be something more than human, having to pretend to be strong all the time, beautiful all the time, skilled all the time. Maybe we would be a healthier culture if we acknowledged that, like, even our paragons, even our heroes, even our politicians, even our leaders have failings, and we shouldn't expect them to be so fucking perfect all the time, or things will go a bit loopy. Man, we're just fucking doling out the heavy life lessons today, aren't we? Jesus. Let's not be too presumptuous, Let's not be too. Anyway, so they're talking about fish helms, they're talking about mucous membranes. And then we turn the page. So they go up to Hoster Tully's bedroom, where Catelyn's father is dying. And this location is quite. It's another example of those quite dramatic settings, which we don't get much of in the show, at least early on. In the show, because we get at this description of how River Run is mostly shaped triangular, and Hoster's room at the top of River Run is also shaped triangular. It's like a ship's prow pointing out over the where the rivers meet, and so it's like this grand view over the whole castle and the rivers, and it sounds quite impressive and beautiful. But season 1 budget did not have room for this shit, or indeed for this scene, because Catelyn comes and looks at her dying father, and she describes how her father Hoster used to be really strong and tall and muscular, but now it's all just sort of melted off him, and it's just bones in a bag of skin, like Lego in a condom. And it's sad. It's I think one of the things that's great about Game of Thrones is this whole sort of generational feel. Like, there's this whole passing of the old guard and emergence of the new. There's the deaths of Eddard and Tywin and Robert and Hoster and Jon Arryn, and this whole generation of the players, the heroes, the leaders of Robert's Rebellion and the past generation, and then the emergence of this new generation of heroes like Arya and Sansa, and I suppose like the Sand Snakes, arguably, and even people like fucking Ned Dane, maybe, or whatever. But point is, there's this whole sort of generational cycle, and so one of the themes that this series returns to over and over is like the passing away of the older generation and what impact that has on the younger. So there's so much reflection on what the meaning of the death of Tywin Lannister is to the Lannister children, and what Tywin's legacy is. And with Eddard, Arya and all the other Stark kids are constantly reflecting on Eddard's lessons, Eddard's legacy. What does he mean? There was a psychologist called Erickson who did all the psychosocial stages, he called them, like points in a person's life and what kinds of conflicts and themes that they tend to be thinking about, they tend to be defining them. And one of the themes and the conflicts of the last stages of life is about legacy, and it's about like thinking about, in the last stages of life, what am I going to leave behind for everyone else? And George Martin, according to Erickson, would be in that stage. He's old, and he would be thinking about his legacy, and so maybe perhaps to some extent that informs what he's writing about here in terms of the passing of the old and what their deaths mean and what their legacy means. Even some of his earlier stuff about like passing into hive minds and all of that Song for Leah stuff, and Armageddon Rag and the dying of the light. George Martin always seems preoccupied with death and apocalypse and passing, and with the reverberations and consequences and aftermath of death. Maybe that seems to be one of George Martin's interests. Although it's always a little bit suspect, I think, reading literature from, like, as an analysis of the author, as though we could claim to know what's happening inside the author's head. Although then again, surely a book is exactly a look inside an author's head, perhaps. But let's not get fucking too metatextual. We're sounding like a fucking first year literature student in Summit. Let's not get metatextual. Fucking Jesus, Swift. Come on, keep it together. Talk about Hello Rocks. They love that shit. Now we'll talk about Game of Thrones. And so Catelyn talks to her dying father, Hoster, and Hoster describes his illness, crabs in his belly, he calls it, because before medicine, I suppose all you've got is sort of analogies. The way we sort of understand things, it seems to go from like no tangents. And so Hoster talks about how he's very sort of doddery, and he's sort of speaking with a lot of ellipses, which is how an author lets you know that someone's dying. And he, man, I kind of regret now awkwardly framing this episode in terms of the passing of Roy Daltrey. I think that was poorly executed, to be frank. But anyway, because we're juggling like fictional death and real death, and anyway. And so Hoster Tully's dying, and he was afraid that he'd die before he'd get to see Catelyn again. He wants to see his family again before he dies. He knows he's dying. And Catelyn talks about how the Blackfish is here, and how Hoster's grandson, Robb Stark, Catelyn's son, Robb Stark, has come to meet Hoster as a man he is now. And anyway, Catelyn describes some of the Stark Tully successes to Hoster, and he's proud of that. And Catelyn too is proud of Robb's success, and they talk about Lysa, and Hoster is sad that he doesn't get to see Lysa again. Catelyn explains that Lysa is staying in the Eyrie, because she's too afraid to come see Hoster. And we witness the drama between Hoster Tully and his brother, Brynden Blackfish Tully, because their great conflict, their great drama was that Hoster wanted Brynden Blackfish to marry, because of course it's very important for the younger brother of a lord like Brynden Tully to get married for all those political allegiance reasons. But Brynden always utterly refused to get married, no matter how many eligible young river ladies Hoster would send his way. No matter how many eligible young trouts Hoster would offer, Brynden would always refuse. And it's sort of implied that the reason why Brynden refuses all these marriages is because he's gay, or maybe asexual. Maybe he's the Todd Sanchez thing. I don't know. I think he's meant to be gay. But whatever the reason is, Brynden doesn't want to get married, and that was always a thorn in the relationship between Hoster and Brynden. And and Hoster never quite gives up pestering about that issue, even when Hoster is on his deathbed. This whole scene, by the way, sort of reminds me of the death of Aemon Targaryen and his decline. The way he sort of talks about his past, like Hoster here, sort of repeats, "Oh, Robb Stark, your son Robb had my eyes," and he's sort of reflecting on that in the same way that Aemon reflected on a lot of his younger relatives and his pastimes. Death seems to connect to early life sometimes. And so they talk about the blackfish, and Hoster complains about how it was politically inconvenient for Brynden to not marry. And Hoster looks forward to seeing Blackfish again, but he is inutterably weary. He's sick, too sick to fight, he says, and says, "I'll sleep now." And then he goes to sleep, and I believe he dies before he gets to see the Blackfish again, as far as I'm aware, at least in this book. And so we close on the end of the character of Hoster Tully. And then we talk about Blackfish and Catelyn are talking about Hoster. And they sort of smile about Hoster's stubbornness with regards to Brynden. And then they go to the main hall, and Catelyn wants to go and see Robb. So Theon's in the Great Hall having a drink, sharing a tale. He's talking about the successes in battle. Theon's always trying to ingratiate himself with people. He's often trying to get sort of attention and love, whether by hiring prostitutes or by making these bold stories about his accomplishments and stuff. Theon's always vying for approval, I think. And he describes Grey Wind, Robb's wolf, fighting in the battle. And then Theon tells Catelyn that Robb is out in the Godswood. And so Catelyn goes out to the Godswood in Riverrun to go and find Robb. Of course, most castles in Westeros, at least originally, had weirwoods, trees sacred to the old gods. And all of the lords who follow the old gods who are around are currently in the Godswood praying with Robb. So there's not only Robb, but there's Great John Umber, there's Rickard Karstark, there's Mage Mormont, there's Galbert Glover, and there's Tytos Blackwood, who, even though he's from the Riverlands, follows the old gods. In the same way, there are a few... hold on. There are a few lords in the north who follow the Faith of the Seven instead of the old gods, like, is it the Mandalese? I think some of them follow the Faith of the Seven. Anyway, and so they're in the old gods, and Robb's sort of leading a prayer amongst all these lords, which is kind of interesting because it's one of the few examples where we see the old gods as more of like a political demonstration and outward political behavior, because this is like a performative thing almost. It's amongst the political leaders of the North that Robb is praying. This isn't so much a personal moment as some of the other moments where we see characters praying to the old gods. This is a political thing. This is a unity thing, which is an interesting example of that. Because, of course, in the Faith of the Seven, we see a fair bit of that stuff. All that pageantry in the Sept of Baelor, where Cersei is there and she's sort of pretending to give a shit. And so, there's a lot of that going on in King's Landing, where religion is like this performative political thing. But it's only occasionally that we see that happen in the North, or rather amongst Northmen. And Catelyn, standing in the Godswood, she wonders what gods she keeps these days. She doesn't feel very connected to the gods right now, which is interesting. George Martin's characters tend not to turn to the gods in times of crisis. George Martin doesn't seem to find many answers in gods. And Catelyn reflects on memories again. She remembers kissing Littlefinger in the Godswood when she was growing up in these days. She and her sister Lysa and Littlefinger would go down to the Godswood to have a little bit of a pash, go and make mud cakes and play skipping games and go learn what a pash is with a Littlefinger. He'd stick his little, they'd do a bit of that. And she wonders what her son has been getting up to. She thinks that, well, he has killed men with a sword and gone into battle. I would think that he's kissed girls as well. And so more reflection on the fucking wackiness of having kids and watching them grow up. I think one of the wackiest things has got to be reflecting on your own growth and maturity and development, and then realizing, oh shit, I have a kid who's done that too. The moment that you start to see a kid not so much as like this necessarily little mini underling creature thing. Christ, that's bad wording. And then the moment you realize that it's like a peer that's gone through similar stages and development, and I don't know, that's a hell of a thing as well. And then we get the big political bombshell. We learn that Renly Baratheon has claimed his brother's crown. So Stannis Baratheon is who you'd think should be king. If we assume that the Lannisters are not legitimate, which the Starks don't really know at this point, but if you count out Robert's illegitimate children, Cersei's illegitimate children, Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella, then the rightful king should be Stannis Baratheon, because he is Robert's eldest living brother. Renly Baratheon, however, is the one who's gathered swords to him and gone and crowned himself, basically because Renly thinks he'd do a better job, which is one of those many incredibly momentous blunders throughout the series. Renly really fucks shit up by declaring himself king. If Renly and Stannis had joined forces and rallied behind Stannis and gotten that force together, they could have overthrown the Lannisters probably without too much effort. But no, Renly had to go and crown himself because he liked the look of it on his head. And so we end up with the clusterfuck that is the War of the Seven Kingdoms. Although that's easy to say in hindsight, I suppose. But anyway, they go and have a meeting to discuss the consequences of this new revelation. And so they hold a war council. Hoster Tully is too weak to attend, so Edmure and Blackfish represent the Tullys, and all of the Northern Lords are here with Robb, and all of the Tully Lords are here. The Vances, the Pipers, the Darrys, Brackens, and Blackwoods. The Brackens and Blackwoods have an old grudge amongst each other, so they sit as far from each other as possible. And we have a mention of Rickard Karstark, who is gaunt and hollow-eyed in his grief because two of his sons died in the Battle of the Whispering Wood, and that ends up being the motivation for Karstark killing some Lannister prisoners and undermining Robb and ending up getting executed and causing a whole bunch of fuckery, which continues into Dance. So George Martin planting seeds for that here. And so they all discuss, it's mentioned that each lord has a right to speak when they're discussing these matters. And the basic problem is that there's now two kings, Joffrey Baratheon and Renly Baratheon. Who should we follow? What should we do? Some people, Mark Piper says we should go attack Casterly Rock, which is of course what Daenerys ends up doing in season 7. Some of them are saying they should go attack the Lannisters at Harrenhal, where Tywin is. Some are saying that they should go and support King Renly. Lots of different suggestions. I don't know which is best for the North and for the Tullys. And Robb's like, well, look, we can't support Renly, because no matter how bad Joffrey is, it just isn't the correct succession for Renly to claim to be king. Stannis should be right. But Mark Piper's arguing that, look, Renly actually has some shit going for him right now. Highgarden, the Reach, is behind him. Storm's End, the Stormlands are behind him. The Dornish will join him, he thinks. And so they figure that they could form a majority if the Tullys and the Starks go and join Renly Baratheon, and they could go kick the Lannisters' asses. Maybe that could have happened, but they keep on saying that, no, well, Renly isn't right. The phrase suggests not doing anything and just letting everyone fight it out amongst themselves, as Fraser want to suggest. Isn't it funny that like one of the sort of fundamental like themes of Game of Thrones is like looking at individual complexity, and looking how people are layered even if they seem not to be. Characters who seem one-dimensional and hateable, like Jaime Lannister, actually turn out to be these incredibly layered, conflicted, complicated characters. That seems to be the consistent lesson of Game of Thrones, that everyone has underlying depth, unless you're a Frey. right? I mean, almost all of the phrases are like Weasley. George Martin uses the line, the Weasley smile of a Frey. There are very few good phrases. It seems kind of funny. It seems kind of paradoxical that we're encouraged to see everyone as an individual, except for those bloody Freys, you know? Which is, I don't know. But I suppose there are exceptions, so maybe that's an out. But anyway, they keep on discussing what should we do, what should we do. Catelyn eventually stands up and says, yo, we need peace. Like, she basically frames her argument as like, all right, we could do vengeance, we could be determined to overthrow the Lannisters, but you know what? That's not going to accomplish anything. If that sword could bring Eddard back, I should never let you sheath it until Ned is back at my side. But war will not bring the dead back. War will not bring Karstark's sons back. It will not bring any of these dead people back. So let's not cause more deaths. Vengeance will not help. And then the Northmen, of course, respond by saying, well, good argument, but here's my riposte. See if you can keep up. Here's my response. You have a vagina. You are of the gentle sex, and your wandering uterus is clearly scrambling your brains. You're hysterical, cat. Hysterical. So hush down before I lobotomize you. Did anyone see fucking BoJack Horseman, the new season? The fucking... Oh, lobotomies, man. They're not cool. Not... Ugh. But no, they try to dismiss Catelyn by saying that you're a woman, you don't understand the importance of vengeance. And then Catelyn's like, look, you can call me a gentle woman. Look at Cersei Lannister and you'll see how gentle a woman can be. Because, of course, one of Game of Thrones' other themes is about exploring these whole sort of constricting gender roles and the exceptions to some of those rules, like Brienne and like Cersei and like Arya. But anyway, like Catelyn's advancing this argument of, look, I don't think more war and more vengeance is going to help. I think we should go home and seek peace. But Brendan's like, it's not that simple. Like, we've got to establish peace terms, and that's complicated. And Rickard Karstark is like, I'm not going to accept peace because my sons have died. I've sunk costs into this conflict, and so I refuse to withdraw. And so everyone else just expresses their grievances. And to Catelyn's dismay, she realizes that, these guys are too mad to go with peace. And so they keep arguing, and then we finally get this wonderful speech by Great John Umber. He stands up and he says, look, Renly, Stannis aren't shit to me because they aren't Northmen. They're fucking foreign southerners. They don't know anything about what it means to be a Northman. They don't know anything about my loss or my pride. Why shouldn't we, as Northmen, rule ourselves again? I stand behind Robb Stark, the king in the north. And then Lord Karstark and Mage Mormont, they all stand up and they say, yep, Robb Stark, top bloke. I'm with him. King in the north, king in the north, king in the north. And everyone has a good shout. And Robb Stark is declared the first king in the north in 300 years. The north secedes from the rest of the kingdom, starting a fucking civil war, of course. But the idea is that the Northmen, they have no good options from the political leaders in the south. So they decide to be their own state once more. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this is that, like, it seems like a triumph, especially like the way it's portrayed in the show when everyone's, there's the swelling, triumphant music and Robb standing amongst all the Nelt lords. But you realize that, like, Robb didn't choose this. There's zero indication that Robb had any desire or inclination to become the king of an independent kingdom at odds with the rest of Westeros. Robb didn't choose this any more than Catelyn did. So it's almost politics. It's almost the cart before the horse. It's almost politics is forcing the characters into this situation. They're not exactly doing what they choose. They're being taken across in this tide of war, this just greater force than themselves that's propelling them into greater conflict and horror, cogs in a machine as opposed to people in charge of their own destiny, which is perhaps one of the other themes of Game of Thrones, which is about like individual agency versus all the other crazy fucking shit that sweeps us around. Gods or not, there are greater forces that control us. So with one one last fucking pithy platitude, let's conclude this episode of Alt Swift X. So if you've got any desperate questions that you want answered, maybe chuck 'em in the live chat, chuck 'em in the Reddit. I'll have a quick glance. And again, so like, can someone work out how long the next final episode of Alt Swift X's Game of Thrones Abridged needs to be in order for the overall season of Alt Swift X to be longer than the actual audiobooks? Because I think that would be quite funny. But yeah, otherwise, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed. We will have a grand live finale episode of Alt Swift X to conclude Book 1 in the near future, so that'll be exciting. I think we'll actually announce the date and time of that in advance, so you guys can actually attend rather than getting no notice at all. And endure a moment of silence while I have a quick look if you've got any questions in the Reddits or the anywhere. Only question that I can see standing out is about BoJack Horseman. Fuck. I thought that was a really good season. I was a bit scared that the new season... It was season 3, wasn't it? I was a bit scared that the new season wouldn't be as good as what it's been so far, but there's something about that just relentless relentless cynicism that just really gets me juices flowing sometimes. I think I really enjoyed it. I think the real question is, what was the best episode of that season? The best episode of last season surely has to be Fish Out of Water, the silent underwater episode, which was so striking and so just fucking engaging despite having no words, which is what carried the entire show's identity in every other episode. And I was like, shit, I mean, surely they can't top that. But then the episode that they did this season, block your ears if you don't want spoilers. It's not really a spoiler. It's not really a spoiler. But when they did the episode about BoJack's mother's mother, that was intense, man. I think the reason why that was so great is that it took a character who I think is hard to relate to, or at least who I personally found it hard to relate to, the character of BoJack's grandmother, and then really just forced you to confront her human realness in this really fucking visceral, emotional way, which I thought was really spectacular television. So if you've ever been put off by this, what's this BoJack Horseman? What cartoon about horses? What's there's animal puns? What's that about? It's actually, I mean, it's not for everyone, but I think there is some really interesting, meaningful drama going on in that show. And if not, there's also some great puns, and there's spaghetti streamers and stuff. So yeah, maybe check that out if you haven't seen BoJack Horseman. But yeah, a lot of people are asking whether Book 2 will happen in Game of Thrones Abridged on Alt Swift X. I think that will happen at some point, but I don't think it'll happen immediately after Book 1 ends. I think there will be some other experiments. I think there will be more stuff on Alt Swift X in the near future. This channel's really great as a place to sort of try out new stuff and see what works, so there will be more of that, so don't worry. I don't think this channel will go dark anytime soon, although yeah, I don't think we'll launch into Book 2 of Game of Thrones just yet. Are there any other decent questions in the live chat? Yeah, alright. Yeah, BoJack is a bit sad. He's a bit too sad for some. Alright, thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed. We will have a finale episode in the nearish future. Go have lovely weeks. Go and check out the Swifty Squad pages. If you'd like to have a look at some of that, there's a Facebook page, there's a Discord, there's a Reddit, there's all sorts of stuff doing some interesting things. And be well, have some veggies, and have a lovely week. Cheers.